The 5th of June, 1940, 3:30 a.m. Dearest Lou, today the second phase of the offensive begins. In an hour we shall be crossing the canal. The Somme is canalized on this part. We've had plenty of time, and so everything, so far as can be foreseen, is well prepared. I shall be observing the attack from well back in the rear. A fortnight, I hope, will see the war over on the mainland, masses of post coming in every day, the whole world sending its congratulations. I've opened nowhere near all the letters yet. There hasn't been time. The offensive was opened by Bock's army group on the right wing, along the Somme. Rundstedt's army group, facing the Aisne, did not join in until 4 days later. Bock was given 3 of the 5 Panzer Corps. 2 of them, forming Kleist's group, were used for a pincer stroke on the Amiens-Peronne sector, while Hoth's corps struck on the extreme right between Amiens and Abbeville. The 2 other Panzer Corps were grouped under Guderian, promoted after his decisive drive to the Channel, and were moved back eastward to the sector of the Aisne near Rethel, southwest of Sedan. Each Panzer Corps consisted of 2 Panzer Divisions and 1 motorized infantry division. The extreme right-wing thrust reached the Seine south of Rouen, 70 miles distant, during the night of the 8th of June, thanks largely to a swift cut-through by Rommel's division after 2 days' tough fighting, and got across the Seine on the heels of the retreating troops. But the main right-wing stroke, by Kleist's Panzer Group, made slower progress and met increasing resistance as it pushed in the direction of Paris. By contrast, Guderian's group made a rapid advance after the Aisne had been crossed in the attack launched there on the 9th of June, so Kleist's group was switched eastward to back up the breakthrough on the Aisne, which became the decisive stroke. For Guderian's group, turning southeast, raced on to the Swiss frontier, thus cutting off the retreat of the French right wing in the Maginot Line. By this time, resistance was collapsing everywhere, and the French had been driven to appeal for an armistice on the night of the 16th of June. While Guderian's exploitation of the breakthrough on the Aisne had been decisive, Rommel's thrust on the other flank had started the collapse. That fact adds all the more significance to his account of the opening and development of the attack across the Somme. His division operated as a spearhead in the crossing itself, as well as in the exploitation. Rommel's stroke was launched on the sector between Longpre and Hangest. Here there was a flat and marshy no-man's land of nearly a mile between the German position on the north bank of the Somme and the French position on the slope south of the river. Across the stretch ran 2 railway tracks, carried on separate bridges over the river, then along embankments through the riverside meadows, and over the Hangest-Longpre road by 2 more bridges. The French had blown up the bridges which carried roads across the Somme at Hangest and near Longpre, but not the 2 railway river bridges, nor even the 2 railway road bridges, which lay so close to their own front. They paid heavily for these omissions, due originally to their own plan for taking the offensive. As a deterrent to any belated attempt to demolish these bridges, Rommel kept them under artillery and machine gun fire by day and night prior to launching his attack on the 5th of June, and succeeded in capturing all 4 intact early that morning. Once the rails had been taken up, his tanks and other vehicles were able to pass over the river and marshy belt with far less delay than if bridges and causeways had had to be built. To overcome such a multiple obstacle in this way was an extraordinary feat. If the French had destroyed even the final pair of bridges over the road, the capture of the bridges over the river would have been of little avail. In a theoretical staff exercise, what Rommel here achieved would hardly have been credited as a practical possibility. At about 4:15 a.m., I drove with Lieutenant Luft and my signal staff to the artillery command post, where we watched the opening of the all-important attack across the Somme. The preparatory barrage, which started punctual to the minute, made an extraordinarily impressive sight from our excellent vantage point. The flash of our shell bursts seemed to be everywhere, and there was little to be heard of enemy counterfire. This being so, we drove to 2nd Battalion's 6th Rifle Regiment's bridging point, where news reached us at about 5 a.m. that the railway and road bridges had fallen intact into our hands. Part of the engineer battalion was already hard at work on the railway bridge, unbolting rails and clearing away sleepers in order to prepare the way for the division to cross with its vehicles. On the other side of the river, the rifle regiment under Colonel von Unger was moving smoothly forward. We heard occasional short bursts of machine gun fire. I now left my signals vehicle on the north bank, giving the crew instructions to be the first vehicle to cross, and walked over the Somme bridges with Lieutenant Luft. The signals vehicle crossed at 6 a.m., followed shortly afterwards by artillery and anti-aircraft units and the 25th Panzer Regiment. The crossing went somewhat slowly, as there was still a considerable number of rails and sleepers to be cleared away. Meanwhile, I drove forward with my signal troop towards the fighting. We had some difficulty in getting the vehicles up the steep slopes, which were devoid of any kind of road or track. I walked a few steps into the cornfield with Lieutenant Luft and Lance Corporal Heidenreich in order to observe the 2 battalions of 6th Rifle Regiment through the glasses. We were a few hundred yards from our vehicle, when a French soldier's head suddenly appeared out of the cornfield in front of us and disappeared again as quickly. Heidenreich walked across and found a wounded Frenchman still with a machine gun beside him. Close by we found more French troops, some dead, others wounded. Our barrage had apparently dealt heavily with the enemy positions. Meanwhile, the leading vehicles of the Panzer Regiment and the artillery and anti-aircraft units were arriving on the steep slopes southwest of the Somme. Colonel Rothenberg, who had crossed with his adjutant in advance of his regiment, received orders to follow up 6th Rifle Regiment along a wide valley to a point behind Hill 116, where they were to take up position for an attack on Le Quesnoy, 5 miles beyond the Somme. French machine gun fire several times forced us to take cover during the briefing. Traffic across the bridge had now ceased again. A Panzer IV had shed its right track and was blocking the entire passage and preventing any other tanks or vehicles from passing. Attempts were being made to drag the tank bodily forwards, with little success as the sleepers were jamming in the rubber rollers and pushing the ballast along in front of them. A good half hour was lost while the Panzer IV was pulled and pushed across the bridge by other tanks. Then the crossing gradually began to move again. By 9 o'clock, the attack to the southwest had made good progress. To eliminate the enemy force in Hengist, which had long been preventing us from bridge building there, a whole panzer battalion was launched against the western outskirts of the village. Their orders were merely to shoot up the enemy in the western outskirts without becoming involved in a fight for the village itself, which was to be cleaned up later by an armored engineer company which was being sent up for that purpose. We watched the battalion approach closer and closer to the village and very soon heard their fire. Then the tanks turned off up the hill to the west, but only a few surmounted the topmost ridge. Most of them stuck on the hill. This route up the steep side of the hill was not very well chosen. The crews, who dismounted from their tanks, were suddenly fired on by enemy machine guns and suffered casualties in the coverless terrain. Meanwhile, a detachment of self-propelled guns under Captain von Fischer came up and bombarded the western outskirts of Hengist. All other troops were directed into the bridgehead position with orders to take up position in preparation for the forthcoming attack. The cleaning up of Hengist was still giving a lot of trouble, and I finally put in the motorcycle battalion under Captain von Hagen. The battalion formed up in extended order for an attack on foot and was on the point of moving off when I drove back to them again to give a further quick order to Captain von Hagen. Before I could do so, my armored command vehicle was fired on by machine guns from Hengist. The bullets clanged against its armored walls but fortunately did not penetrate, though direct hits were scored on the aerial and machine gun mounting. An NCO in the 8-wheeled armored signals lorry behind us was too slow getting his head down and was seriously wounded. The enemy in Hengist continued to cover the road with fire for some time, but finally the motorcycle battalion attacked and reached its objective. From 12 o'clock onwards, heavy enemy artillery began to bombard the area of our Somme crossing, and shells fell thick and fast on both sides of the road over which the division was slowly but steadily moving forward. The hills west of the Somme and the hollows in which we were forming up for the attack were also the target of intermittent heavy shelling. Though casualties were light, the effect on morale of the heavy gunfire was not inconsiderable. The bridgeheads west of the Somme continued to fill with units of all arms and soon became overcrowded. At midday, I was informed by Heidkamper that the 5th Panzer Division's attack would not be starting until 4 p.m., and that the 2nd Motorized Division had so far only gained 2,000 yards of ground. In these circumstances, I also ordered the attack to be resumed at 4 p.m. Orders were for the 25th Panzer Regiment to attack through the 6th Rifle Regiment to Le Quesnoy. The 37th Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, following behind the Panzer Regiment, was to protect the rear of both its flanks and to open fire in passing on all likely-looking woods on either side of the route. The 7th Rifle Regiment was to follow up in its carriers. The orders for the artillery in AA were first to cover the division as it debouched from the assembly area and then to leapfrog forward behind the moving attack. After the attack, the territory which had been overrun was to be occupied by the infantry and was to have artillery, anti-tank and anti-aircraft units positioned in it in depth in such a manner that the maximum artillery support could be provided against any attack, whether from the west, south, or east. I was able to give these orders verbally, undisturbed by the enemy artillery fire, which was still dropping intermittently into our territory. At 4 p.m. sharp, the tanks moved to the attack. The various arms worked in such perfect coordination that it might have been a peacetime exercise. The French colonial troops opposing us, who were dug in the small woods on the southern slopes of hills 116 and 104 with large numbers of field and anti-tank guns, defended themselves desperately. However, the tanks and reconnaissance battalion poured such a hail of fire into the woods as they passed that the enemy fire was at first not too heavy. I rode in my command vehicle with Luft near the rear of the tank column and had good radio contact throughout with Heidkamper and the regiments. From time to time, enemy fire clanged against the vehicle's armored sides and forced us to get our heads down. In the northern outskirts of Le Quesnoy, a fierce battle developed. The Panzer Regiment mopped up the enemy in its usual style, in spite of the fact that they had installed themselves very skillfully round the outskirts of the village. This was particularly true of the wall round Château Le Quesnoy, which was held by a battalion of colored troops. Stones had been wrenched out all along the wall to make loopholes from which large numbers of machine and anti-tank guns poured their fire into the oncoming tanks. But even here they had no success, for the rapid fire of our tanks, particularly the shells of the Panzer IVs, soon smashed the enemy forces. While one battalion of tanks moved round Le Quesnoy to the west, Rothenburg took the main body forward close alongside the wall, the armored cars following up behind, then held the enemy in check long enough to allow the leading infantry units to come up. Firing and fighting without a break, the tanks rolled round both sides of Le Quesnoy and came out on the wide and coverless plain to its south. On they went through fields of high-grown corn. Any enemy troops who were sighted were either wiped out or forced to withdraw. Large numbers of prisoners were brought in, many of them hopelessly drunk. Most of the prisoners were colored troops. Our objective for the day, as set by Corps, being the country east of Hornoy, I decided to continue the attack at 7:25 p.m. through Montagne-le-Fayel and Camps Amiénois. Orders were quickly issued. A large concentration of enemy troops in the Bois de Riancourt was destroyed by the fire of the Panzer Regiment's tanks as they drove past. Over to our left, a giant pillar of smoke belched up from a burning enemy petrol tanker, and numerous saddled horses stampeded riderless across the plain. Then heavy enemy artillery fire from the southwest crashed into the division, but was unable to halt its attack. Over a broad front and in great depth, tanks, anti-aircraft guns, field guns, all with infantry mounted on them, raced across country east of the road. Vast clouds of dust rose high into the evening sky over the flat plain. A corps order arrived refusing authority for the advance through Montagne-le-Fayel, 8 miles beyond the Somme, because of the danger the division would run of attack by our own dive bombers. I therefore gave orders, verbally and by radio, for the advance to be halted and all units to dig in the area they had reached.